Given the circumstances, I'm not sure we're going to complete all the material, so I'm gonna skip some things. I think you have the slides downloaded that people can get a copy of the slides. I just wanted to comment about a few things that I heard this morning. I think I mentioned that we ran into water rights issues in Colorado and wound up having to move from Colorado, which we'd lived there 20 years. And so we started the process of looking, and once we had made the decision, well, it's become clear that we really need to move. One of my goals was to try to find an institution, a school or a lifestyle center that was really interested in agriculture. And I'd done this long enough, and I'd been part of institutions and everything like that, and I kind of knew what questions to ask to see whether it was really desired or it was just thought that we're supposed to do it. And there's a very big difference between somebody thinking we're supposed to do this and somebody thinking that we have to do this. And so we'd made the decision to move, but we didn't want everybody to know we'd made the decision to move. We wanted to be able to kind of look around and feel out and see what we found and saw. We wanted to try to look at different institutions or schools and see what they were saying already before we ever spoke to them or they spoke to us. My father-in-law decided that he needed to let everybody know that we were no longer going to be where we were. And if you know what his connections were, we started getting phone calls. And so at that point, we had gotten 3 phone calls from different places asking us if we would be interested in coming there and doing the agriculture for them and teaching agriculture. And we said, well, we'll talk about it a little bit more. We looked at the institutions, we said we'll talk about it a little bit more. ASI was coming up, and so they were going to be at ASI, so we decided to go to ASI then we would visit there and see what came from it and everything. My wife wasn't able to attend, but my oldest daughter went with me. And in the process of getting ready to go, we've actually found a family in Kentucky who was running a lifestyle center as a family, and were full time. And they were trying to do agriculture, but they were just too busy to do that, and because they wanted to grow their own food to provide to their guests at the lifestyle center. And so we arranged for the opportunity to visit them while we were at ASI. And so me and my daughter went to ASI. By the time we got done at ASI, we had 32 invitations instead of 3. And that's not counting the one that we actually thought might be the one. And they were, that was a little bit overwhelming. And I don't share that from ego or anything like that. It was honestly very overwhelming to me because I have a big burden for agriculture. And I think that we're missing out an awful lot on the benefits from it, and I'm going to talk about that tomorrow night. But so anyway, me and my daughter decided that we would run over to visit this place. And in the meantime, we'd also started looking at properties because we felt like, well, this is maybe after talking to them on the phone and everything, this is maybe where the Lord's leading us to go. So we started looking at my wife started looking at properties, and I can appreciate the conversation because for my wife, what's the house like? And everything. And everything. For me, it was about what's the land like. And so, anyway, I won't share a whole lot about the story going to visit this family who was running that. It turns out that we actually moved to Kentucky to work with them. The funny thing is, and you never know what the Lord has in store for you, the funny thing is and I don't have the time to tell that story. About 2 years later, they moved back to Washington State. So there's a new group in there, and I'm going to share a little bit about that relative to the stuff I'll be talking about anyway. But we went to look at this one property. It was 10 acres. It had a almost 5,000 square foot house on it, and that sounds like a lot, but your context kind of plays a role in what you're looking for. We were actually looking for a place where we could bring interns in. We had the space to bring interns in and train them. And so we were looking for a bigger place. And this place was about 5,000 square feet. And the downstairs was able to be separated from the upstairs. It had its own kitchen and all the facilities and everything. And so that was great. We thought, well, that's great because we have the place that we could bring people already available. And so we went to visit the property, and the was showing us around the house first. And so I was following along, looking around. My daughter was a lot more engaged in, all the details about the house and everything. And so it was a beautiful house. The property was up for sale for $400,000, and that sounds like a lot, but just to build the house that was on that property would have cost about $1 million. This was a couple that was divorcing, and it was part of the settlement. They were selling the house, and why they were selling it that cheap, I don't know. Maybe it was out of spite or something. And so we were looking at the house. We looked at upstairs, downstairs. It was great, as far as having the two spaces and having plenty. And my wife loves big houses. We're getting older now, and a lot of our kids have grown up and stuff like that. I don't know that we need that much space anymore, but she'd be happy with it. So we looked at the house, and we walked around through it and everything, and the realtors asked, so what do you think? I hadn't seen it. It was in a beautiful city, and but the house and the property was kind of going up the side of the valley. It wasn't out, in the middle of the valley and everything. And so I said, well, it looks great. And I said, can I go look at the outside? So I went out and started looking at the land. And it had a nice barn on it. I guess the other one's cutting out. Is this one okay? I guess this other one is cutting out a little bit. So I wanted to see what the land was like. And so I went out, started walking around the land. It had a nice shop on it, and service building stuff. Had a pond on it, but there wasn't enough land. All I needed was 1 or 2 acres, but there wasn't enough land to grow on. But the funny part about this is, so my wife wanted to buy it, but I said, well, this is not going to work for what we're actually do and stuff. And the funny part about it is my daughter came out. She stayed in with the realtor longer, and the realtor was all frustrated and everything. She said, well, what does your dad think? It didn't seem like he was paying attention or anything like that. And she said, yeah, he doesn't care about the house. He wants to know what the land's like. That's why he's out there. But it wasn't going to work. It was a great deal, and there was a possibility we could have bought some more land in addition to that was right next to it. But then I discovered that there was a homeowners association. And the homeowners association was we would have had an uphill battle of trying to do what we wanted to do. So there's a lot of factors that you have to take into consideration when you're thinking about purchasing. I'm really glad, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more, but I'm really glad that Yusuela shared her story. Because when you're looking at water, you need to not only look at the source, that you have water or the potential for water, but you need to look at what the quality of that water is. I can't tell you how many people have bought properties and how many growers I work with who have been frustrated, not knowing what was wrong, and it turns out that the quality of their water was so bad that they couldn't get anywhere with their growing. And the options for treating that water were prohibitive. I mean, you were talking about very expensive and everything. So you want to be sure when you're looking at a property that you're considering not only the availability of water, but the quality of that water that you're going to be able to get. I mentioned before, I think that God had been pleased to bring me into situations to teach me things I didn't know. And our property in Colorado there was one of those situations with water, where we looked at the property, we liked the house, everything about it. We had a well, and I didn't even think about, and the well was running at 10 or 15 gallons a minute. We drip irrigate everything, so I was no problem. I could set up zones and work with that flow rate and everything. But I never considered what the water itself was like. And we bought that property. And it turns out that water was terrible. I was doing the fertility part, and I'd already been doing it for several years and everything, and I wasn't getting anywhere. And I started seeing this white powder on the top of my drip lines. And the soil was getting harder. And so finally, I said, it's got to be the water. Tomorrow, it's got to be the water. So I started investigating the water, and we had a water test done on the water. And now I'm talking about for agriculture, for growing like your garden or for growing produce, but you might want to consider it for your own well-being as well. It turns out that the pH of that water was only 5.6. So it can strip nutrients at that level. And the bad thing about it too was that the alkaline minerals that were in it was sodium and bicarbonate. And sodium bicarbonate in your water, what will happen is the bicarbonate will grab whatever calcium or even iron is in your soil and convert it back to a carbonate, like a lime. And the sodium will take the place of the calcium on those colloids that I was talking about. And remember what I said sodium does to soil? It collapses your soil structure. And so this is what I was battling with there. And I was compensating by putting extra calcium on and things like that. And we finally had to put a treatment system on our water to overcome that situation. But I never considered the quality of the water when we bought that property. I always do now. And I've been surprised ever since then. I did a lot of training on how to deal with poor quality water after that. And I was surprised to discover how many places have poor quality water. And they don't even know that they're having the problems that they have as a result of that on it. One other thing, and then we're going to go to this. When I talk to a person about considering a piece of property, not only do I tell them, you want to see if there's an area that you can have a garden, depending on your scale, if you're just gardening, or if you're market gardening, you're going to need a little bit more space. But you also need to know what's it going to take. Now, most people don't think about this. They go and they work up ground, and their garden grows great, and then in most cases over time it goes downhill if you don't really do anything. Some cases you'll get 1 year out. This is what when pioneers in the United States and even Canada, when they started moving west, they started taking forest out. They'd cut clear forest and they'd grow and they'd get a year out of it, crop, and the next year nothing would grow. And so they learned the lesson. And so every year they just take out more forest to plant again because they didn't really understand fertility like they should have understood it. But I strongly suggest, for the cost of what it costs to do the soil test, I encourage people to test that soil and see what they're going to have to deal with. Because some soils are going to be reasonable to work with, and other soils are going to be really tough. It's not that it's not impossible to fix them and to work with them. It's just that some cases it's going to be more expensive, and it's going to take more time than others. And I don't necessarily tell them not to get a piece of land. Depends on what all the other factors are. But not to get a piece of land just because that's going to be a challenge, because it can be worked with. It can be fixed. But it's always good to know as many variables ahead of time when you're going into something as what you're going to have to expect and what you're going to have to plan for. Because if you, like me with the water, with that property we bought, and like I said, I'd never thought about water before. Well, that became a real hassle for us that we had to deal with and address. And thankfully, we were able to. And we're going to get to water here in a minute. I'm going to show you one that's not workable. So, anyway, there were a few more thoughts that came up. I probably better just leave it at that. The other guys did a pretty good job of just trying to give you some framework to really consider on what it is that you're. And your context, just because somebody else does something, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do those things. You have to find what fits for you and what your mission is, your purpose. I'm in agriculture and I grow produce for a living, so I'm going to be a little bit more particular on that aspect, and that's what that realtor lady found out. Which test? Oh, we can do that. Let's wait till we get to the water. I'll tell you, we're going to get to the water here. I'm going to actually skip some of these, going through all of these nutrients. You guys have the PDF with all of those on there, so you can ask for a copy of those, and then you can go through them yourself and read through them and everything. There's just a couple more here I want to touch on because I think it's really important too. And then we're going to actually jump to the next section, which is external influences, and water is included in that, environmental external influences on that. So we started talking about nitrogen. Here's the nitrogen cycle, and one of the things that has happened is we've become too dependent on man-made systems. And so we started, migrating towards more and more the convenience of man-made systems and man-made practices. But you can actually generate all the nitrogen that you need out of your soil if you have the conditions for that to happen. And in fact, a lot of this has been developed a long time ago about how to do that, is how to actually use the natural nitrogen cycle and capitalize on, when we get to the biology part, capitalize on the organisms in the soil and growing a healthy plant to actually generate all the nitrogen. You can use, and I won't take too long here, but you can use cover crops and green manure crops in addition to your planted crops and everything to generate nitrogen that's in the soil for your next crop to use and everything. So I just put this in here not to go through the whole thing, but to just point out that nitrogen is one of the biggest nutrients that people have issues with. And we don't have to have issues with them. But there is a requirement in order for you to be able to achieve, all of that nitrogen you need to grow good crops. I'm not saying okay crops, but really good crops where you have plenty of nitrogen available, either from accumulating it from cover crops and green manure crops, or from the natural nitrogen fixers functioning during the growing season, providing part of that to you. So that's going to be it on that. The next nutrient we want to talk about is phosphorus, and phosphorus has a triple negative charge. And you've heard me mention before, well, let's go down through these functions first, and then I'll talk about that. So phosphorus is involved in reproduction, in the reproductive growth of the plant, so flowers and fruiting, seeds is required for that. It's part of the genetic material. It's part of energy storage and transfer, early root growth. If you don't have good phosphorus levels, you guys are in a shorter growing season up here. So you want to do everything you could possibly do to get those seeds up out of the ground and moving along to maturity. And this is one of the ways of doing that, is having adequate phosphorus levels in the soil. You'll get good early root growth and get those plants off and growing to where they can get to the point where they're bearing the fruit that you want. It aids in blooming and fruiting, speeds crop maturity, which I just mentioned, and it's somewhat mobile. So you can have deficiency symptoms of phosphorus depending on how bad it is. You can have it in the older part of the plant, you can have it in the younger part of the plant, and the desired value here. Now we moved away from, when I was talking about that bucket, I was talking about those cation elements, the positively charged elements, calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. That's what goes in that bucket. When we get to the anions, there's just a certain amount of pounds that you're wanting to shoot for when you measure on a test that is actually in the soil for you to get optimum availability from those nutrients. And in this case, with the modeling that I use, your desired value is 220 to 330 pounds of phosphorus available. Now, it's not, again, it's one of those situations where it's not soluble, it's not completely soluble, it's held, but it's made available for the plants and the microbes to get it. And this is actually, when I say 220 to 330 pounds, this is actually as elemental phosphorus. Most of the time you're going to look at, when people are talking about phosphorus, they're going to talk about it as the compound or the molecule phosphate, P2O5. And if you're looking at it as that, your desired value is going to be about 500 to 750 pounds on it. But I try to do everything as elemental because it's all consistent across the board. But like I said yesterday, potassium and phosphorus are represented typically as compounds, potash, which is K2O, and phosphate, which is P2O5. And nobody knows why. Maybe when you look at three numbers, when you get a fertilizer bag, it has the three numbers on it. That's nitrogen, phosphate, and potash, not nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And so the percentage that they say is in that fertilizer you're buying is based on those compounds, not on the elements. And the only answer I ever got is why they did it that way is because then you think you're getting more in the bag than you really are. But nobody really knows why. But it's very confusing. Actually, people are trying to learn this, and you have some compounds. And when we get to sulfur, which is the last one I'm going to do, it gets confusing about what are the major elements, what are secondary elements. And so nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, or nitrogen, phosphate, and potash, as it would be said in mainstream, are considered primary elements. Those three are considered primary elements because you have to have them in adequate amounts to grow a crop. But let's finish phosphorus, and when we get to sulfur, you'll see that that's not completely true. Okay, with deficiencies on phosphorus, you'll get stunted growth, reddening or purpling of leaves, and poor or no flowering or fruiting. Has anybody had plants that grew and they just didn't fruit? They didn't set fruit, or they didn't even flower? Remember that apricot tree that I had told you it hadn't, after 6 years, and never even flowered, let alone not set fruit. It just didn't. Yeah, and so this is not the only element that can cause that to happen, but inadequate levels of phosphorus can cause a plant to simply not flower, or to flower but not set very much fruit because there's not adequate phosphorus there for that to happen. And excess is tie-up of other nutrients and poor growth. You'll also get excess poor growth because of the tie-up of other nutrients. So calcium and phosphorus are like the heavy hitters in the soil. Those two combined can tie up everything else in your soil if they're in excess. And so you don't want them in excess. And remember, I'd shared 2 or 3 times, I think, that organic growers who use a lot of organic materials, compost, manures, things like that, mulches that they put on the surface and then eventually till in or they break down, more than 50% of them have excessive phosphorus because they're not really mindful. People are generally not really mindful of the quantity they're putting on and what that volume actually contains in it. And so a lot of times people are putting on as a mulch to protect the ground, or they're putting it on as a source for nitrogen, and they're not really doing the math to figure out everything else that's coming along with that. And when we get to carbon fertility, we're going to talk about that a little bit more. And you really need to know, and I had also said that phosphorus, almost everything else you can leach out of the soil if you have to. And sometimes grow it out. If it makes more sense to grow it out so you don't waste it, then that's what I usually recommend you do. But phosphorus, that's not true. Nobody knows how to get rid of excessive phosphorus. Nobody. And I mean nobody. None of the universities, all the smart people in soil science and everything, nobody has to get rid of it. Now, you can get so much phosphorus that it actually starts leaching. But when you're at that point, it is so bad that probably you're not getting a whole lot of anything to grow on it. Oh, okay. Sorry, I had said 220 to 330 pounds. That's per acre. It would be on a per acre basis. So and we could convert it to per hectare. With there's 2.5. Okay. Okay. Yeah. It just multiplied by 2.5, and that would be, on per hectare, and then we'd have to convert it to kilos if you wanted it in kilos. But okay. All right. So don't overdo it. And if you, I'm not saying not to use any organic materials because they're certainly beneficial. We're going to talk about that when we get to the carbon fertility. They can certainly be very beneficial and helpful for various reasons. But you also have to be mindful, and I'm going to talk about this when we get there, about air elements and earth elements. Stuff leaves, and some stuff stays behind. And so we'll talk about it more when we get there. Okay, sources, hard rock phosphate, if you can find it. A lot of the times you can't find hard rock phosphate anymore. It's 24 to 30%, but it's also up to 30% calcium. So any natural phosphorus source you get is going to have calcium with it too. And so you need to know that you need both calcium and phosphorus if you're going to use that material. It's a long-term source because it's slower to break down, but the better the biology in the soil, the easier it will be to break that down. There are phosphorus solubilizing bacteria in the soil that can easily break down hard rock phosphate, but they need a food source, and the plant is usually the food source, and they get the food source from the plant via mycorrhizal fungi most of the time, and so you have to have those conditions in order for that to work well. Then you have colloidal or reactive phosphate. Colloidal is just a clay phosphate, and reactive phosphate is similar. They're just two different sources and it's usually what the material that they wash off of the high-grade hard rock phosphate ore that they're going to take, and they're going to process it into a commercial, more soluble source of phosphorus. So what they'll do is they'll take the hard rock phosphate, they'll treat it with gypsum. I'm sorry, not gypsum, sulfur. They'll treat it with sulfur, and remember it's calcium phosphate. So they treat it with sulfur and they get calcium sulfate and a more concentrated form of phosphorus. And this was a product called superphosphate that used to be available. It's not really available anymore, that farmers used to use. And remember I said that sulfur has kind of disappeared from the process? Well, this is one of the ones where it disappeared. Farmers didn't even know that they were putting sulfur on. They bought the product because of the phosphate in it. And so they didn't even know they were putting calcium and sulfur on, and in most cases, it was actually helping to keep their soils fertile. But because of the cost of shipping and because they could sell the product separately and everything, it's all been processed out. They now treat the material with phosphoric acid and concentrate it even more and remove the gypsum out of there. So it's a highly concentrated phosphorus source. It has a pH of 3, and you put it on the soil, and it goes back to hard rock phosphate. So you have all this process to concentrate it, and then you put it on the soil, and nature wants to stabilize it, and it just takes it back. So it's only available for a short period of time before it's actually put back into a form that is more stable in your soil. You still have it there, and if you have the biology to make it available, then you'll still get it. But the problem is when you put something with a pH of 3 on the soil, it's going to do some damage in the process of nature trying to stabilize it. So. Then you have a couple other sources, and both of these sources are good sources if you need both calcium and phosphorus. And when I work with growers and I'm doing recommendations for them, I always try to give them the product that's going to give them the most benefit in getting them where they need to go. And this is preferential if this is the material is available to them. You have two manufacturer sources which are also good sources because they're chemically stable. They're not extreme like the triple superphosphate is. Monoammonium phosphate, and you see the percentages there. It's 11% nitrogen, but it's an ammonium nitrogen, not a nitrate nitrogen, and 52% phosphate. I can't remember what that is now. It's only around 24% actual phosphorus, if I remember right. Diammonium phosphate just has a little bit more ammonium nitrogen in it and a little bit less of the phosphate in it. Bone meal, and also fish bone meal. Fish bone meal has become available as organic has become more popular. They started now processing it for it to be used as a soil amendment. But again, it has a little bit of nitrogen in it, but you still have the calcium in it in those products. And so you still have to consider whether or not you need the calcium with it. Compost and animal manures, we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to carbon fertility. It ranges from 0.5% to 3%, depending on the product source you're using.
Is there any health concerns with the bone meal? Like, where are they getting the bone?
Yeah, so any processed animal product, you should have some concern about. The way I've overcome this with some of the things, there's only a couple things that I use that are animal-based products when I need them. The best way to overcome that is simply by having a vigorous biological community in your soil, because they'll degrade it, they'll break it down, and it won't be a problem for you. Now, there's some things people want to use them, and if they do, I'll recommend it, but it's not preferential. Like people using blood meal as a nitrogen source, I don't really encourage that. And there's a few others. I do use feather meal, which is it's a digested chicken and turkey feather for a protein source, and I haven't experienced any issues with that. If I could get organic, if it really is organic, but if I could get organic, feather meal, then I would. But when you go to choosing a product like that, you're going to wind up spending a lot more money to get it. And so if you have the money, then, by all means, if you can avoid, because animals are fed, the feed that animals are fed is pretty much all GMO anymore, the grains that they're fed. And so you have that reality. The thing is that the downside to it is because glyphosate is a chelator, it just means simply that those animals are not getting minerals that they need. Now, most people who raise livestock supplement those animals with those minerals because their animals would be dying if they didn't. And so they're still coming in the animal, and the glyphosate itself is not really very prevalent in certain materials like the feather meal. Okay, and then on the bottom again here I put phosphorus solubilizing microbes. There are bacteria that can solubilize phosphorus out of your soil. Most soils have probably a few thousand pounds of phosphorus in their soil, and if you can tap into that resource, then certainly it's a good opportunity because it's already there. Not all soils have a large amount, and there's a school of thought in agriculture that every soil has every mineral element in adequate amounts, and you just have to get the biology to release it. And I can tell you after 32 years that they have not demonstrated that to me yet, that that's the case. You go down south in the U.S. where you have hot, humid weather, lots of rainfall, and lots of temperature, and we're going to talk about that a little bit here. Those soils are really weathered, and there's really a lot of things that are not there. Some parent material just simply doesn't have things. Remember when I showed that picture of New Zealand and when we were talking about organic growth? Those islands had no cobalt. It just didn't have them. So you could do all the biological stuff you wanted, and you weren't going to get anything out of there. And so there are areas like up where you guys are, and up where a lot more of the glacial, activity was. There is a lot more latent fertility that can be tapped into, and so that's another good reason. The reason you would want to do encourage the biology is then because you can tap into that at the same time. So it'll slow down how much you're actually having to add to keep your balance there. Because if it's in the soil already and the microbes in the soil can access it because they've got the conditions to do that, then you don't have to add it so often. By the way, I should say once you actually get phosphorus to ideal levels, it might be a long time before you ever add any more. A long time. It depends on the parent material, but I know growers that once they've got it there, remember I've talked about growers that had it in excess and 25 years later, they still are excessive. But you can also get it built to that optimum level there, And because you're enhancing the conditions for the biology, they're going to continue releasing it out of that soil and maintain your levels on it. So if you can get it there, then it generally stays there fairly well, in this case in particular. Okay, this is probably the last one I'll talk about. There may be one more. And like I said, these slides are available so you can get the information on the other elements that are on them. Sulfur is a double negative charge. It's an anion as well. And it's involved in the production of sulfur-containing proteins. I've talked about this, so I won't spend a lot of time talking about it. I think that the lack of sulfur in soils is one of the major contributors to autoimmune diseases and allergies now. That's one of the reasons you're seeing a proliferation of those things. Because you're not able to, plants that are lacking sulfur are not able to produce the sulfur-containing amino acids. And as a result, proteins are not built right. Some proteins aren't built at all. And you consume a food with a wonky protein, with a protein that's not built right, and your body looks at it as a foreign substance and reacts to it as if it's a foreign substance and attacks it to destroy it. And if those are kind of built into your body tissue, then it's not good for your body when your own immune system starts attacking it. It's involved in chlorophyll production, nodulation of legumes. So if you were wanting to fix nitrogen with symbiotic or free-living nitrogen-fixing bacteria, you have to have adequate sulfur in order for the nodules that they fix the nitrogen in can be formed. Nitrogen is fixed by these bacteria in an anaerobic environment, in other words, absent of oxygen. And so when they build these nodules, there's no oxygen in there, and they fix the nitrogen within that nodule, and then it's released then the plant can get it from there. But without adequate sulfur, that process is not going to work very well. It's also involved in seed production, significant in seed production. So if you're producing a seed-producing crop, for sure you really need to have adequate sulfur levels there. Desired value is 100 to 200 pounds per acre, depending on, you only need about 100 pounds, sometimes even less than that. If you don't have any excesses that you need to get out of your soil. Sulfur is the element that you can leach out excessive cations, positive charged elements. So if you have too much calcium, magnesium, potassium, or sodium, you can use sulfur to leach those out of your soil. And you just need to get them out of the top 6 to 8 inches in order for it to improve the situation. But the calcium and magnesium had 2 charges, remember? And so it'll take, for each pound of calcium, it's going to take 2 pounds of sulfur to remove it. For potassium and sodium, we only had 1 charge. It's going to take only 1 pound to remove a pound of potassium or sodium out of that. And so you have to know what's going on in your soil in order to manage this kind of situation where how much do I put on, because sulfur is antagonistic to phosphorus, and phosphorus is antagonistic to sulfur. And I don't even really like that term. They just have jobs to do, and if one person is pushing in and taking too much of the space as opposed to the other one, then it can't do its job adequately. So I've had a grower that was really deficient in phosphorus, and they were excessive in calcium. And they were certified naturally grown. So it's like certified organic. It's a different certification. And so they wanted to maintain that certification. And I said, well, you don't have it. You really need the phosphorus, but all the sources have a lot of calcium in it. His water also had calcium in it. So, but he was determined that he was going to use a natural product. And I just say to you that manufactured inorganic chemistry, if it's stable chemistry, is just as effective as a natural source. Now, when you go to organic chemistry, you're talking about an entirely different thing. And that can be very risky to use man-made organic chemistry. But if it's inorganic chemistry, I've never noticed any difference about its effectiveness or creating any problems, because the requirements are pretty high purity when they produce the product to be what it is. And so the mine product is pretty much the same thing. It might have just a few other impurities with it on it. Back to the phosphorus, by the way, on that subject. that triple charge that phosphorus has, it likes to grab onto everything. And one of the things that it likes to grab onto is heavy metals. So the mine sources or the natural sources of rock phosphate or soft rock phosphate all have heavy metals in them, whereas the manufacturer source does not have the heavy metals in it. The reactive phosphate, which is what I use if I need phosphorus, the reactive phosphate has very little heavy metals in it, as opposed to the colloidal phosphate. But just keep that in mind, because when you're thinking about, well, the natural stuff's going to be better for me, well, maybe not. Where that comes into a problem is if you start depleting, your situation gets very acidic, and that phosphorus starts separating from the metals that it's attached to. And calcium is a metal, by the way. People realize that, but and it starts separating. You start diminishing those nutrient cations, and it starts separating. You can release heavy metals into your soil that are potentially a problem. So you need to know what's required and how much is required and how to maintain stability there, so that you don't create a condition like that. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to share too about between sulfur and phosphate, and I said phosphate on purpose, is remember I said in the mainstream agricultural community, when they talk about phosphorus, they talk about it as the compound phosphate, the molecule phosphate, because that's how the plant takes it up. And when they talk about sulfur, they talk about elemental sulfur. And so they've classified sulfur as a secondary element, not a primary element. But if you were to take phosphorus and you were to compare phosphorus as an element to sulfur as an element, you need just as much sulfur as you do phosphorus. If you were to convert sulfur to sulfate, which is the compound that plants take up the sulfur in, and compare it to phosphate, you need just as much. Now, most of you guys are not growing field corn and soybeans. You're growing tomatoes and peppers and eggplant and onions and garlic and lettuce and those types of things, right? It actually takes, particularly brassicas, which would be broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, and some of the greens in that family, and alliums, onions, garlic, shallots, those things, they all require more sulfur than they do phosphorus. And most of the others require as much, if not more sometimes, as phosphorus. Now, here's the kicker about all this. Phosphorus doesn't leach. Sulfur is easily leached out of the soil. If a person does a soil test and we recommend sulfur and they put the sulfur on, the next year when they do the test again, I expect to see most of that sulfur gone. It was either utilized in the growing of the crop, or the microbes utilize it for their growth, or it got leached out. Now, when I make the recommendation is to try to get it so there's none wasted through leaching, but it's inevitable unless you live in a low rainfall area that it's going to leach out and you're going to lose it. If I ever see high levels of sulfur still, then you've got a compaction problem. You've got a structure problem in your soil. If there's still a lot of sulfur sticking around. And there's more to it, but we don't have the time to go into more details about some of this stuff. But did you have a question?
Does sulfur pull other elements with it too when it leaches?
It can, yeah. Like calcium sulfate and potassium sulfate and magnesium sulfate.
So you don't want to throw too much on that.
No, it's that thus far no further principle. Where is the balance at? Finding the balance is so that you're maximizing the fertility of that soil, but you're not, creating problems, and you're not wasting product. Like I said, sulfur can take some of those cations out. So I look at it and I say, okay, if you have too much of something, what kind of problem is it creating? Do we really need to get rid of it really fast, or can we grow it out over the next 3 years so that you don't have to just lose it by leaching it out and not having it? There's some cases where it's really bad and you got to get it moving out of there. But remember I said it's antagonistic with phosphorus? And so if you have low phosphorus levels, you can only get so aggressive with sulfur to remove stuff, because you'll start suppressing phosphorus and you already have low levels. then you'll create problems that way. This is the way it is all across soil fertility. With each one of these elements, they have relationships with other elements, and they have to work together. They have to cooperate with each other at the right level. Otherwise, you create a problem with one or the other, or both sometimes. So it's an important principle to learn that there's balance is important. Moderation, you've heard about the term moderation. Yeah, that's what we're talking about here. Okay, so deficiency symptoms are similar to nitrogen. Generally, it looks more like an overall pale green color of the leaves. Your plant just doesn't really have a nice green color. Now, people who use too much nitrogen, you can have this really dark green plant, and that's really too much. It's not really supposed to be that dark green. Or you can overuse iron, and it almost has this black green color to it. But you want a nice rich green to the color of the leaf. And the shade will be a little bit different depending on the plant that you're growing, but you want it to be a nice opaque, rich colored green on there. If it's not, and a lot of times you'll see it up in the growing tip, where the growing tip coming out will be kind of yellowed a little bit. It depends on whether you have a monocot like grasses, or you have a dicot like broadleaf plants too. Broadleaf plants, it'll show up as that general pale green. In monocots like grasses, like if you're growing corn, you're going to see sometimes the whorl, the growing tip in the corn will be more of a yellow color, but you'll also see striping in the leaf start showing up on that. So the type of plant it is, it manifests itself a little bit different on it. Excess symptoms are symptoms of other anion deficiencies due to suppression, which I just mentioned. Other anions get suppressed: phosphorus, nitrogen, molybdenum, boron. All of those can get suppressed, and any of those can suppress the others because of the antagonistic effect of having too much or not enough of the other on it. Okay, so these are the sources for sulfur. Elemental sulfur, which is 90 to 92% sulfur, and I'm going to come back to that one. Ammonium sulfate, which is a nitrogen and sulfur source, which is 21% nitrogen and 24% sulfur. I recommend, I mentioned that one as a good source when we were on nitrogen, and the reason is because it has the sulfur. You have to have about 9 to 10 parts nitrogen to every 1 part sulfur in order to get amino acids properly built. If you don't have the sulfur there, or you don't have a good balance, you can have way too much nitrogen. You would have had okay sulfur, but you have way too much nitrogen, you're going to have a problem. If you don't have enough nitrogen and you have too much sulfur, any which one of them you need, it's about 9 or 10 to 1 and the amounts that you want in your soil. But ammonium sulfate, if you need it, you're getting nitrogen, you're getting sulfur to the mix. So it all depends on what the whole picture looks like, is which material is going to make the most sense to add. Gypsum is calcium sulfate, so if you need calcium and you need sulfur, this is a good source. Where you want to, I better just skip that. Okay. That'll take too long. Sulfomag, we mentioned before, as sulfate of potash, magnesia. So it has sulfur, potassium, and magnesium. So if you need a source that has, and you need all 3 of those things, that's a good source as well. Magnesium sulfate, Epsom salts was mentioned before if you need for magnesium, but if also for sulfur, if you need magnesium and sulfur, then that's a good source. And then potassium sulfate, which we talked about before too. If you need both of those things, that's a good source. So when I have to do a recommendation, I get a lab report from somebody, whether it's for a garden or a market garden or for a field crop grower. I have to look at the whole picture and see what's needed, and then figure out, okay, what materials are going to make the most sense. And then sometimes I have to have the grower tell me, I can't get this and I can't get that, but I can get this and I can get that. And sometimes you have to use the second best choice in order to get the result that you want. But you have to look at the whole picture and decide, okay, what's going to meet the needs that are needed in this particular case. Okay, that's it on sulfur. I do want to do boron too for a reason here. We're now into the trace elements. And I remember I pointed out that they consider sulfur a secondary element, but it should be a primary element. along with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. In actuality, it's used as much in as much quantity most of the time as phosphorus is, and it leaches and phosphorus doesn't. And that one thing there is like non-existent in mainline agriculture, that understanding, because they look at phosphate as a compound and they look at sulfur as an element, and they don't understand the requirement that's there. But they're just now discovering it. They're starting to discover that they're having problems that are sulfur related. It's been long they realize they're having problems that are sulfur related on it. Okay, so we're into what they're called trace elements. By the way, calcium and magnesium and sodium is, in most cases, unless you're growing a sodium sensitive crop, most growers just don't even pay attention to sodium. But calcium and magnesium are those other major cations. They call them secondary elements along with sulfur. But if you look at the fact that you're needing to address structure and nutrition, then they should be primary elements too. In fact, there's not one of these that you can really ignore. So it's a matter of understanding how they work together on it. So we're into trace elements. Boron is an anion as well. I'm not sure why I didn't put the charge on that. But its functions are cell wall integrity, keeps calcium mobile, setting flowers. Remember that apricot tree picture with the flowers? That was the number one thing that was missing. When I looked at the soil test and he said it had never flowered, they were almost totally non-existent in boron. And so I said, because they had really good calcium levels, I gave them a very aggressive plan to get boron levels up before the next spring. And in reality, we're probably not going to be able to talk about it a whole lot, but you kind of need to know how a plant actually grows. Like in a fruit tree like that, in the fall, it's determining what it's going to do in the spring. Your buds are being determined and established. The strength of buds are being determined in the fall. If you're growing blueberries or blackberries, or not so much on biennial crops, it's not quite the same, but on blueberries or bush crops like that, they're determining what your potential yield is in the fall. And you've already established, so you can do things in the spring that might give you the greatest opportunity to get the best yield that you could. But if you want the best yield, in reality, you really need in the fall be making sure that the plants have what they need. And boron is one of those big ones. And that's what the biggest thing. There was some copper issue too, but the biggest thing in that case was boron. It was just deficient. And so it doesn't have to be in the fall, but preferable, especially with trace elements. Now, having said that, boron also leaches just like sulfur. And so, what's that? They flowered. They hadn't flowered for 6 years. And she sent me that picture. They were so thrilled because we asked if they should. You might not have been here. I was saying that they should just go ahead and pull the trees and everything. And I said, well, if you're willing to give them another year or two probation, let's see if this is the problem. And, just over winter, from the fall to the spring, they went from not producing any flowers to producing flowers. And I think I said, unfortunately, they only got one apricot to set because of the crazy weather we were getting this spring. But they did get one apricot to set, and they were excited about that one apricot. But going forward, we couldn't get the boron all the way to the level that it really needed to be. We just got it to a level that would allow it to actually set flowers and be able to potentially fruit. Boron leaches like sulfur. And so you need to keep that in mind when you're applying it. So if you wanted to put it on in the fall, if you put it on in the fall and you have something growing that can capture it, or if things are going to freeze up and you're really not going to have a lot of leaching, you can put it on in the fall, and it's still going to, most of it will still be there in the spring.
Even with the melt?
Well, with the melt, you're probably going to lose some. But I assume it's going to start melting before you thaw out the ground too. So some of that melt is going to go before it actually starts infiltrating into your soil and everything. And it'd have to move all the way through the soil to take it out with it. But it's just something to keep in mind. These are the two things that these two elements you really have to pay attention to. And it's one of the reasons we'll talk about when we get in carbon fertility. It's one of the reasons you really want to build your organic matter levels in your soil to the highest level you can, because humus actually has anion storage capacity, and it can actually store boron, it can store sulfur, and these other anions that are not held by the negatively charged colloids.
That's what I want to say. Composted leaves like hummus. My blueberry blooms so good and gives so much yield like never before.
Mm-hmm.
But it's so much. Could a change that leaves to boron when it's like a
It may not have been inadequate boron. It may have been moisture conditions. It may have been temperature conditions that were improved. Plus, you're getting nutrition. You're getting energy out of the breaking down leaves, and you're getting nutrients out of there. The plant.
That's what I mean. Cannot turn to this boron when it's composting like a hummus.
Yeah, you can supply some boron that way. It comes back to that thus far and no further principle, where if you start getting into trouble with some other nutrient because of the addition of those materials, that's when you have to be careful about continuing to apply it. If you don't run into that problem, you can do it year in and year out and not have to worry about it. But you need to know that you're not running into that problem on it. Some people have a soil that is naturally high in phosphorus, and other things that they're doing is adding it. And so they will run into a problem sooner than other people who don't have a lot of phosphorus in their soil. You may be able to go 10 or 20 years with the amount of phosphorus that you're getting in like the leaves she's talking about. You might be able to go 10 or 20 years before you may even potentially run into a problem. It's just being mindful of the fact, and we're gonna talk about that when we get to the carbon fertility on it. Yeah.
Did you say boron have a connection with vitamin B12?
No, that was cobalt. So let's go on and go through the things here. The functions of boron are cell wall integrity, keeps calcium mobile, flower set, translocation of starches and sugars, immobile. Remember I talked about you could show a calcium deficiency, and it's not actually a calcium deficiency, but it's a boron deficiency, because boron helps calcium get into the plant, and it also helps keep it mobile in the plant to get where it needs to be. And if you don't have adequate boron, you might wind up with calcium problems, but it's not because of a lack of calcium in the soil, it's because of a lack of boron to get it into the plant and get it where it needs to go in the plant on that. So it's just keeping that in mind with it. And translocation of starches and sugars. Did I tell about the gardener in Oregon? I don't think I did, because you probably would have said yeah. So I'll tell you this. I have a gardener. He's just gardening. He has an orchard too, but a gardener that I do soil fertility for out in Oregon. And we had gotten his garden fantastic. Everything was really good. And things were growing really well, and they were doing really well. But he called me, not last year, but the year before last, and he said, everything's fantastic. But he said, the one end of my garden, when I harvested the potatoes, they just didn't look good the whole season. And so when I harvested them, they had scab. Anybody had scab on potatoes before?
Yeah.
What were you told was the problem? What's that?
Me, I didn't know what I was doing.
Oh, okay. Most of the time you'll be told it's because you limed the soil, because you put calcium on. And it can be the reason, but it's not the cause. Anyway, so the rest of his plants weren't growing very well either. He said the corn's not doing very well. None of the plants look great. And I said, well, are you willing to test it separately? I mean, I'm talking about a garden. He has a big garden, but it was a garden. It wasn't, a half acre or an acre or anything like that. And he said, yeah, I want to know what's going on. So he sent the test in. I got it back, and I suspected what it may be, because the parent material layer is naturally high in potassium. And we had gotten the potassium down below that threshold in the garden. So, and the cause of scab on potatoes is manganese deficiency, not calcium. When you put calcium or you put lime on, you raise the pH and you tie up manganese. And so if you're borderline manganese levels, that's why people say that liming your soil causes scab. But it's because you're tying up the manganese. You don't have really good manganese levels and you're pulling it down below a point where the plants can't get adequate manganese on it. But he had fantastic, in his garden, he had fantastic manganese levels, he had fantastic boron levels. And so the test came back and his potassium levels were over 10%. Remember I said you don't ever want to go over 7.5%. His were over 10%. Now that parent material is naturally high in potassium, and just as you migrated that little bit down the garden to a different area of the soil, it was exceeded that threshold, and we hadn't brought it down enough with what we had done already in the whole garden. And so, well, I said the reason things are not growing well, when potassium is over 7.5%, it starts tying boron up. And he had great boron levels. He had fantastic boron levels, but that excessive potassium was tying it up. And that's why his potatoes were little. He had little scabby potatoes. The sugars and the starches didn't get translocated into the tuber. He had but I want you to hear this. He had fantastic boron levels, but the potassium excess was tying it up. And the plants couldn't get adequate to move the starches and the sugars into whether it's into the fruit, in this case it was into the tuber of the potato. And the other problem he had is because it was over 10%, if you have more than between sodium and potassium, in this case it was all potassium, if you exceed 10% between the two of those, you're going to block out manganese. And again, he had fantastic manganese levels, but because he had over 10% saturation of potassium, he was blocking out the manganese, and that's why he had the scab on the potatoes. So we brought that back down. We brought that down using sulfur. We brought the potassium down below 7.5%, and it's all growing just as well as the rest of the garden now. In that particular case, we were able to do it in 1 year. Some cases it might take 2 or 3 years. It depends on how much you're dealing with and what you need to do. And let me give you a piece of advice here. A lot of times people think they ought to do this or they ought to do that, but they don't really know for sure because they haven't measured any of this. And people do things that cause these kind of problems for themselves because they put something on that they didn't really need, and they put it on to the extent that it started causing other problems for them. And not only did they spend the time and the money and the energy on applying that, now they're going to have to spend time, money, and energy to reverse it. It is much better to know what you need to do before you do it than to... And like I said, we like to compare ourselves among ourselves, but the Bible says not to do that. And so my garden, boy, that worked great in my garden, so you ought to do it. I'll have to tell you this story. It came to my head. I had somebody that doesn't live too far from me, very well-off, well-to-do person, wealthy person and everything, thinks very highly of themselves and everything, but in some respects, and I won't give too many details because I don't want anybody to figure out who it is, but in some respects is over thrifty in the wrong ways. And for the wrong things. But anyway, he said to me, he said, "Hey, we don't live that far away. Can I just do what you're doing? Can I just put the stuff on that you're putting on in your garden?" And I said, "Well, I'll tell you what I do if you agree to one thing." And so I said, "If you agree that our condition, mine and yours, is identical in every particular, I'll tell you." And he said, "Oh, well, that's not true." I said, "Well, I'm not telling you. Because what you need is different than what I need. We have a model, but we need to come from where we are to that model, not from where somebody else is. And we only wind up, now, well, I'll share this when I get to carbon fertility, but you need to keep this in mind when you listen to the witness of others. is that there may be value in that witness that they're sharing. For you, there may be nothing for somebody else. And so be sure that take that into consideration. If somebody doesn't do or embrace what you think ought to be and everything like that, don't be offended by that. It's just simply because that may not be the thing that they need and appreciate. So, okay. The desired value on this is 1.5 to 2 parts per million. Since we're on trace elements here, and parts per million, just you multiply that times 2 and you get the amount of pounds. So it's 2 to 4 pounds, or 3 to 4 pounds on it per acre, and that's based on a 2 million pound plow layer. So it's based on 2 million pounds. So you want 3 to 4 pounds of boron per acre in your soil. Now you can go higher than that. If you get into a really high exchange capacity soil and you have lots of calcium, I mean several thousand pounds of calcium, you can go higher than this. But this is something that is reserved for, okay, you've got the conditions for this, so let's do this. I have to tell you a story about boron too. With another individual, had an intern, and he called me one day and he said, we may have a problem. And I said, oh, what do you mean? And he said, well, remember we were supposed to put 2 pounds of actual boron on? Well, my intern is from Europe, and he didn't understand English really well, and he wound up putting on 20 pounds. So I'll just let you know that boron as boric acid, which is actually the form the plant uses, but boron can kill things. You can actually use it. They don't allow it in certified organic, but you can actually use boron to kill wheat. If you have vegetation, it's a phytotoxic reaction, so it doesn't persist. But so the immediate thought in my mind is, oh, hopefully he doesn't have a crop in the ground yet. I said, do you have anything growing yet? Oh yeah, we got our whole lettuce and greens crop in already and stuff. Well, something else I knew about this farm is that they had really high calcium levels. I think it was like 76%. He was well above what he needed to have. And remember I said calcium controls everything? So this is the one situation. I said, your calcium levels are pretty high, so it's possible that it's going to control that excess boron. I said, but you might want to pray. Anyway, because the hope here is that it'll control the boron. But I said, we need to pray about this anyway, and did. So he called me back. It was a month later. I get busy that time of year, and I never checked back with him to see how things worked out. But he called me back a month later and said, that field that we put too much boron on? You see, we had the best crop we'd ever had. Now, in telling you that story, I'm not encouraging you have to have I'm not encouraging you to indulge yourself in that type of thing. Because I don't really know. I have a high degree of confidence that high level of calcium controlled that boron, but it very well may have been that God's mercy, gave them a blessing. So. Well, because boron easily leaches, that high of a quantity, a lot of it would probably wind up leaching out. But as long as he has the control there, he's probably going to benefit from having that high boron there. Because boron, I haven't mentioned, we haven't got to that yet, or as a function, actually disease resistance. Boron is involved in disease resistance significantly. And so with that high a level, it's just that, when I do this kind of stuff, everything that I recommend, I put down on paper to recommend to somebody, it has to hold up in a court of law. Now, I'll go on the phone with somebody and I'll say, you've got the conditions that we could probably be aggressive, and push it a little bit on this particular thing, and I think that would be helpful. But I won't put it down on paper, and I leave it up to the grower to say, okay, yeah, we're going to try this. I'm not going to get to copper, but there was another one. Copper is one of those things that also provides for disease resistance. You need it in optimum levels, just like boron, for it to give you the disease resistance. It's required nutritionally as well. But there was a watermelon grower. Copper and sulfur will be the two key elements of giving you sweet melons. And so this grower was told that if you just add, I think it was 5 pounds. It was 5 pounds of elemental or copper sulfate, which is 25% copper. If you just add 5 pounds, you get sweeter melons. But that was broadcasting, 5 pounds over an acre. He banned it underneath his watermelon row, what was the equivalent of 70 pounds of copper. Now again, because it was banded, the plant had the ability to go other places than into that copper, and he also had really good calcium levels. But the same thing happened. He said, we had the sweetest watermelons we'd ever had with that. He would have accomplished that with 5 pounds too. So you run into this kind of stuff when you're working with growers too. All kinds of crazy stuff happens. But
Can I just ask a question? With regards to soil, before you purchase the land, can you test the soil before you buy?
yes, and I a little bit earlier I mentioned it. I strongly encourage that for people to test the soil to know what they're starting with, what they would, and what's going to be required to improve that soil so that they can get good healthy crops.
Do you have a test that would say perhaps that would show contamination as well as proper soil fertility?
You can have tests run that'll show contamination.
But do you know of one specifically?
Not right off the top of my head. There are labs that will run tests for contaminants, depending on if there's heavy metals or what different things like that. There are labs that'll run it and do that for you. Okay, we're at 1:30, and I think it's lunchtime. But I want to just finish boron real quick, and then if somebody has some questions, we'll take a few more questions. But we'll stop so that if people want to go get their lunch and everything, we can do that. So your sources are sodium borate. Does anybody know what 20-multene borax is? That's sodium borate. Oh, did you? Out in California? Yeah. Okay, so that's an 11% sodium borate, and that would be you'd put on about 2 pounds per acre at a time, which would be about or 2 pounds of actual boron, which would be about 20 pounds of 20-multene borax, or another boron source like calcium sodium borate is 10%. There are other sources and it's a matter of how many water molecules are in it, and that's why it goes up to 20%. It's actually about 20.5% on there. And then boric acid, which is 17%, that's the form the plant uses it in. And you can if you have problems with ants, you can use boric acid to remove an ant problem if you have it as well. Okay, let's get this finished up. Deficiency, growing tip dieback. The reason for that is because boron is not mobile in the plant. And so your growing tip is where you're going to see it occur first. It's going to start dying back. You can have internal stem disorders. So have you ever had a tomato plant? I grow indeterminate tomato plants, so they vine up tall. Have you ever had a node where the stem splits and there's an opening in the middle? That's boron deficiency. That's what it's talking about with internal stem disorders, where you have that split in the stem like that. That's a boron deficiency. Okay, excess phytotoxic reaction and death. So if you put too much on and there's too much there, legumes in particular are very sensitive to too much boron. They'll luxury consume it in the seedling stage and kill themselves. So this is another thing I have to know what growers are going to be growing, because if we were going to get aggressive with boron, you can't do it, or you got to wait until it assimilates, integrates into the soil before you can you can plant legumes like green beans, peas, things like that. Once they're out of the seedling stage, they stop the luxury consumption. So, but if they can't make it through the seedling stage, they're not gonna do really well. And to avoid this phytotoxic reaction, you want to apply no more than 2 pounds of actual boron per acre at one time. Now, I have that written down there, but there are times when we'll apply 2 or 3 times that. But there are conditions, again, great calcium levels, other factors where, and most of the time when that's done, it's done before a crop is planted. And it's given time to assimilate with rainfall and moisture and things like that. Okay, we're going to stop there. I don't know if I'm going to continue with these. This information is on for the rest of them. We need to jump because we only have one session left, as far as I know, to try to get to some of the other material I think is important. So if you need to leave, we're done. If you have a question or somebody has a question, I'll be happy to answer that.
I have a question about boron and borax, because somebody told me that this soap, borax, is the same like boron. Is that true?
Yeah, that's what I just said. Yeah, 20 multein borax in the grocery store is 11% sodium borate.
Okay.
Yep.
Now, one more question. You didn't mention much zinc, and somebody told me my pear tree hardly ever, never bear fruit and hardly have a flower. And he told me that it's missing zinc. Is that true?
Well, it could be other things, but it can be zinc also if you have inadequate amounts of zinc. One of the things you can tell if you have inadequate amounts of zinc is the length to width ratio of the leaves. Now, certain leaves have a certain length to width ratio just because of the shape of the leaf. But the better the zinc levels, the wider the leaf is going to be. And so if you have really skinny leaves, the other thing that you can notice sometimes is the edges of the leaves are not really sharp. There's not a clear-cut edge to it. You see it on tomatoes sometimes where they're kind of curled down a little bit. They're not really a sharp, straight edge on there. But yes, it can, because zinc is involved in so many enzyme systems, hundreds of enzyme systems. In fact, zinc is probably one of those nutritional elements that people are really lacking in. Then a lot of problems are a result of that. But it's possible that zinc could be involved in that. But it could also be boron, it could be phosphorus. If you're not flowering and fruiting, it could be those things as well on it. Okay, any other questions? Oh.
Sorry, so we did a soil test years ago, and we'd like to do another one, but at the time we had to do the soil sample, and it was complicated getting it to the States and stuff like that. Like, where do you know anywhere in Canada that does the right soil tests, or where in the States are we?
I don't know if we'll be able to have a conversation about that. I talked to your husband about this a little bit. It was a problem for a while getting stuff out of Canada, but stuff that goes to the lab that I use, it comes out of Canada all the time. So I don't think that you should. I have cards, and then if I run out of cards, maybe you can just take a picture of it on there. You can get a hold of me. But yeah, you want to use. I'm going to tell you want to use a specific lab. You can talk to your husband about what I talked to him about with that. But the soil testing industry has really messed a lot of things up just because they wanted to push what was cheap and quick. Yeah, the lab is actually peri-agricultural labs, but if you want me to, you'll have to, if you want a recommendation that you don't have to interpret the lab data yourself, it's going to have to either go through Kinsey Ag Services out of Charleston, Missouri, or you'll have to work with me. I work through Kinsey Ag Services to provide, that service and everything, but yes, he actually is the only person in the world right now that is preserving the model that I use. And it was the Albrecht model that was developed 100 years ago. And it's been attacked and criticized, published papers. In fact, a guy stood up in a meeting that I was at who worked for a university, and Neil Kinsey, who actually learned from Dr. William Albrecht before he died in 1976. He's the only person still alive that actually learned from him. And he's in his 80s now. So an individual who worked for a major agricultural university stood up when Neil was talking about the fact that there's a deliberate assault on this model. And the guy stood up and he said, what you're saying is exactly right. In fact, he said there's a coordinated effort worldwide to discredit what you're doing. And the reason is because it works.
Not only that, I can see where it will lead back to Sabbath keeping. If you follow that model, it points to a creator who knows what he's doing. And the balance in the soil is a balance in our health. So that's intelligent design.
Well, let me tell you the story of how it started getting opposed. Dr. Albrecht used to work at the University of Missouri, and he had a presentation one time, and he was talking about this what they'd learned and how it was being implemented and how effective it was. And he said we can bring nutrition to the point where we can eliminate. Now, he was talking in particular, in this case, animal diseases, but he said the same thing about human disease. We can eliminate all the diseases that our animals, and if you go and you look at the diseases that animals are facing, they're the same ones we are, because we're just as malnourished. But he said this out loud. And sitting in the audience was the head of the animal science department. And he didn't like that. And from that day forward, what Dr. Albrecht did, all of his work was opposed. And then, of course, you had the Green Revolution coming in after World War II and using all the synthetic fertilizers and everything like that. And he opposed that. He almost became USDA, our agriculture secretary. If Dewey, when he ran against, who is it now? I think it was quite a few years ago. He lost in the presidential election, but if he would have won, Albrecht would have become the USDA agricultural secretary and everything. And this is what would have been promoted. And in reality, the behind the scenes, the USDA and their National Soil Lab and everything, they still use this modeling. But you can't promote it because you have vested interests who want something different. And so if you want to be privately, people will say one thing, publicly they'll say something else, because they'll lose their job if they do. And so the model is used all over the world now. There's only about 75 people that actually know how to use it worldwide, which is unfortunate. There should be 7,500 or 75,000 or more. But because it's so misrepresented in everything, but it's used all over the world, in almost every country worldwide. And it succeeds because you're focusing on the soil, you're focusing on character, if you want to put it that way. It succeeds no matter what the crop is. It's utilized in agriculture, it's utilized in horticulture, it's utilized in agroforestry. There are forestry companies that use helicopters. They test their soils and they use helicopters to fly on what they need, because it accelerates, it speeds up the growth of the trees, and the quality of the wood when they harvest it is superior. And so, yeah. And landscaping uses it. There's not a field that doesn't utilize it, and it works really well. But it has to be worked, and you have to be able to overcome all of the opposition to it. I get given a hard time all the time from one place or another. I don't have a degree in agronomy or soil science, so I get that one all the time. What qualifies you to say anything?
What are who?
Yeah.
One issue when we're talking about getting sources of product, like you mentioned boron but like organic sources of calcium, phosphate, and all these like for instance, you mentioned cottonseed meal and things like that. Some of those things are hard for us to get. They're extremely like C90 was for a while was extremely hard to get. And so you said you have contacts with Canadians, right? So my question to you is that like with certain products that we can't get, could we contact you possibly to find these products? Because I give you an example. We use a company called BioAg, which has a bunch of them, but it's missing a bunch.
More and more are not available anymore.
Yeah, so the question was about what about sources for the right materials that you need to use? I can tell you that Satan is not leaving any stone unturned to prevent you from doing what's right. And so we this is an increasing problem where fertilizer dealers used to carry a broad spectrum of these elements. Now it's just becoming very few and far between where you can find these materials because they're resorting to incomplete chemistry, and then they're using organic chemistry. They're using interventions, chemicals to keep crops alive to harvest them, and that's what the vested interests want. But if you want your plants to stay alive and thrive so that you will be alive and thrive, you have to have the fertility in the soil. So one of the things that has frustrated me is, as Adventists, we should have developed an entire network ourselves of not only people trained to help people, because not everybody is going to be able to take the time to really dig in and deep and learn all the details of all this information and everything. Have somebody that can, in districts that can help people with that. Have co-ops where you have resources available to people to get these mineral elements and other supplies possibly for irrigation and season extension and things like that. We do have some, but we just don't have that infrastructure, unfortunately, and it's becoming that question is asked to me almost every time I send out a recommendation and I get a question back. Where do I get this from? And there are some places where they're fortunate. There's one Amish operation in Pennsylvania, and he understands this model, and he has everything that you could need. There's a place up in the Northwest that has just about everything, not everything. If you're out in places like California, for example, and I would be surprised if there wasn't more available up here in Ontario, because they grow a lot of vegetables up here, don't they? Carrots, onions.
We get a bunch of the things, but like there's certain like C90. We had to get it from the States, and
We got it from in Elmira, Aurora area.
so we eventually got it, but to find it.
Yeah, and it's a challenge, and I work on that all the time to try to find sources for certain regions and
Like health meal, like you can get it from New Brunswick, supposedly, but we ended up getting it from the States, and it's from New Brunswick, but we're getting it from the States, and it's
Kind of like gas.
where they harvest most of that. Well, some comes from Norway, but most of that is harvested off of the coast of Canada, the east coast of Canada.
we can't get it. We were having a hard time getting it here, but we had to get it through the States or something. There's Englishness. So what I'm saying is that
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I'll have to tell you that that's not going to get any easier. And my hope continues to be that some people will step up and say, "Hey, we're gonna take care of this part." But there has to be a certain amount of demand.
That's it.
If there's and I tell people, if you guys are in an area here, co-op together what all you need and see if you have to have it shipped in, then you can divide the shipping cost among yourselves rather than somebody having to, each of you individually bringing it in and wind up paying 5-10 times for the shipping to do that. Some of those, we're going to have to come up with creative ways to solve these problems, because everything we need to do is going to get harder to do. So don't wait. Like cobalt. Remember I was talking about cobalt? And I mentioned manganese. Both of those are used in the production of electric vehicles. And the price of those has gone out the roof as a result of the fact of the demand for those things.
It's also available through pottery, though.
Yes,
Pottery needs those.
right. And so see, this is a creative solution. I was working with a grower in Tanzania, Africa, and he needed a lot. He needed a lot of things, but one of the big things he needed was boron, and it was illegal in Tanzania. It was illegal to use boron in agriculture.
Wow.
And remember I said it leaches?
Yeah.
But we found boron that they use in the glass industry to temper glass, and so we were able to get boron. So you have to kind of get creative and figure out. Now he wasn't supposed to apply it, but
Maybe we can start.
C90 here, it was supposed to be for feed for animals.
yeah.
Maybe we can start taking those electric cars and just tearing them apart for.
Okay. We better quit. One more, and then we'll quit. And then if you have questions, I can still.
Do you know if you can bring these things over the border? Like if you were driving, can you bring them across the border?
I think that you can. Depends on the quantity. Now, I know they won't allow cobalt across because Canada produces cobalt. Of course, it's really hard to get for agriculture, but they're very protective of their cobalt industry up here, so they won't allow cobalt to come across the border.
So we have it here, though.
You have it here.
So available for us as farmers.
I don't know if you have. There's a consultant out in Alberta, a German fellow, Peter Eggers. I'll have to get a hold of him and ask where he gets his from, because I've had some growers out in Western Canada who couldn't get it, and they wanted to ship it up. That's how I found out that they couldn't get it because they wouldn't let it cross the border.
But if you have I found that if you have your paperwork from your test, they can see where you're going with it. You know what I
Right.
mean? So they would allow us to have things.
Yeah, your odds would be a lot better. I mean, I wasn't sure if I was going to make it here because they didn't believe my story that I was coming, where and why I was coming to Madoc. What's in Madoc? And then they thought it was coming up to earn money, and all kinds of stuff. So anyway, you have to have good information to give them to sway them the right way.
Are you want to close for us?
Yeah, so let's close. If there's any other questions, I'll be happy to answer them. But let's just go ahead and close with prayer. Father in heaven, we're just thankful that we can come together, not only to fellowship, but to help each other out with knowledge and understanding. And I just pray that knowledge and understanding would be retained and that the ability to apply it would be also available. And I pray now as we go to eat our lunch meal that you would bless that meal and you would bless the hands that prepared it, again, to use for your glory and service. In Jesus' name, amen.